name is Derek Smith, and today we're going to talk about woodwind doubling. We will talk briefly about the history of doubling, finding your why, my philosophy behind doubling, and then take a look at some of the mechanics of tone production. A brief background on myself. I'm a saxophonist and woodwind specialist currently residing in Seattle, Washington. These days, I primarily work as a performer in the pit orchestras and musical theater productions, playing all of the woodwinds, including double reeds. While this is my primary form of performance currently, I have been involved in all manners of musical settings, including recording studios, chamber ensembles, big bands, top 40 horn sections, opera and ballet orchestras, small group jazz settings, blues bands, and even had a brief stint in a hip-hop ensemble. I love making great music, and I love playing woodwind instruments. I'm not going to give you a detailed rundown of the history of woodwind doubling, as that would take up a huge chunk of our time. I will say that the history of woodwind doubling goes all the way back to the 14th century and has developed extensively over the years. The first woodwind doubling that looks like what we know and are familiar with today can be traced all the way back to the time of Mozart and Haydn, involving double reeds written to double on flute and clarinet. As orchestras expand personnel, this practice loses favor. However, with the development of harmony instruments within the woodwind families, piccolo, bass clarinet, English horn, etc., the idea of woodwind doubling still exists to this day in the orchestral world. Although woodwind doubling between different families within the orchestra is no longer a common occurrence, woodwind doubling within the realm of commercial music has been going strong for many years and is still very prevalent in the professional world, and especially the standard rep of our great big band traditions. If you would like to take a more in-depth look at the history of woodwind doubling, there's a great article written by Ed Jaffe over at his website on jaffewoodwinds.com. Why should you be interested in woodwind doubling? Hopefully your answer is not because I have to for big band, but if it is right now, that's okay. Although that may be your impetus for exploring this world, I hope that by the end of this video your answer will be because I want to. My own path to woodwind doubling began because I knew I would have to. I started on saxophone in 5th grade band, and after playing saxophone through middle school and getting my first taste of playing in a big band, I wanted to explore some other instruments before attending high school. Part of my reasoning was that I knew I wanted to be competitive and for placing into the top big bands at my new high school. I saw their saxophone section doubling on flutes and clarinets at a joint concert while I was in middle school, so I figured I should probably look into that. Another reason was although I loved playing saxophone in jazz band, I dreaded playing my middle school band tenor saxophone parts. I rarely got to play the fun parts that my clarinet and flute playing friends played, so I started some clarinet lessons over the summers. A couple of years later, after some experience playing clarinet in marching band and bass clarinet in the wind ensemble, I was developing a greater appreciation for classical ensembles and wanted to start playing in our youth orchestra. I knew that there wasn't a regular spot for the saxophone, and it would be very tough to catch up to the clarinet players that had been studying for a number of years already, but there was a shortage of bassoon players. So much to my high school band director's delight, I decided to give bassoon a shot. I was lucky that our band program had a bassoon available, and I had parents that made some sacrifices to get me into bassoon lessons. Within a year of bassoon lessons and a lot of hours practicing, I was playing second bassoon in our local youth orchestra, clarinet and marching band, bassoon in my high school wind ensemble, and tenor saxophone in the jazz band at my high school. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because my journey has really shaped my why for woodwind doubling. My reason for woodwind doubling is because I want to play all kinds of music, and I enjoy the variety of playing different instruments. Although I didn't know it at the time, my entire career has been shaped by these early motivations to be involved in a variety of ensembles. I don't think I would be where I am today if the only reason I ever picked up a clarinet or flute was just because I have to. Here are some benefits of woodwind doubling that may help you find your why. Increased opportunities for performing. If you're a saxophone player, the chances of playing in an orchestra are very slim. And they're wonderful ensembles with great rep and music that we should be exposed to. Another reason is increased opportunities for teaching lessons. Assuming that you want to pursue a career in music, or just have music be a part of your life and a way of earning money, if you learn how to play one of these instruments to a high enough level, you can teach more lessons. Another great reason is that increased knowledge of other instruments can inform playing on your primary instrument. Knowing the tendencies of the flute player or the clarinet player while you're playing saxophone or bassoon or any other instrument can help you blend better or match their pitch or accommodate some idiosyncrasies of the instruments that they may be playing. What are some other benefits you can think of? Now that we've identified some potential benefits of woodwind doubling, maybe you're starting to find your why, and you want to start or continue exploring other instruments, let's talk about getting in the right mindset for approaching woodwind doubling, or the philosophy. First things first, I actually do not like to use the term woodwind doubler or doubler. Historically, I've encountered some negative perceptions of the term amongst other musicians, and I believe it can also put us in the wrong mindset for approaching the study of the instruments. I prefer the term woodwind specialist, or more simply, if someone asks me what do you do, or what do you play, I say I play woodwinds. This all ties into my overall philosophy of playing multiple instruments, and really any instrument. I believe that if you can play in time, in tune, while playing with a great and stylistically appropriate sound for the setting, then you have the potential for having a successful career as a musician, or just plain enjoying music making more. It shouldn't matter to your fellow musicians that after you sit down and rehearse a Beethoven symphony for 3 hours on flute, you might go play in a jazz club that evening on saxophone. If you meet those 3 criteria on whatever instrument you are holding at any given time, in tune, great sound, while being prepared for the gig, you deserve to be there as much as anyone else. The flip side of this coin is that we must hold ourselves to the same standards of performance as our colleagues who study a single instrument. What does this mean? It means seeking out the knowledge and history of any instrument you choose to pursue and putting in the time to develop your fundamentals. It means not making excuses for ourselves. Oh, I'm just a doubler. That's good enough for a doubler. That may not sound quite right, but can the other oboe player play saxophone? I don't think so. Our job, regardless of what level we play at, is to serve the music and the ensemble we are playing with. This can seem like a very daunting task. Learning one instrument can be an enormous undertaking, let alone 2 or 3 or more. How can I possibly do this without just turning into a giant ball of stress and giving up? A couple of things to note before we move into some practical considerations of playing multiple instruments. Although you may be very experienced on one instrument already, everyone's affinity for transferring skills to another instrument is different. Try not to compare yourself to anyone else. Be patient with yourself. It's taken time to achieve the level you are currently at with your main instrument. While some aspects of your new instrument may come faster, some things cannot replace repetition and experience with your new instrument. By now you might be asking yourself, so how do I go about playing multiple instruments? Due to time constraints, we are by no means going to explore every aspect of performance on all of the woodwinds. I'm going to limit our discussions to the instruments you're most likely to encounter in a commercial or jazz setting, and we're going to focus primarily on the fundamentals of sound production, breathing, establishing an embouchure, and delivering the air to each instrument. Because if you remember, if you can play in time, in tune, with a good sound, you can start to make your path as a multiple woodwind performer. Principles of finger training can easily be transferred from your primary instrument, so we won't really go into differences of fingerings between instruments in detail. There are many resources available for finding correct fingerings for the various woodwind instruments. My own method of practicing multiple woodwind instruments involves dividing skills into 2 categories: concepts that are universal amongst all of the woodwind instruments, and concepts I need to remember each time I pick up a flute or a clarinet. Now, I may talk and think about the mechanics of playing an instrument more frequently than someone who plays only one instrument. I've had fantastic teachers that rarely mention the mechanics of producing sound on their instrument and gain tremendous amounts of knowledge from them. I do, however, feel that with switching instruments on a regular basis comes a necessity for thinking about the mechanics of sound production on each instrument. This aids in learning the instrument and also helps differentiate techniques between instruments and assists when fast, accurate switching is required. As we talk about the mechanics of tone production on each instrument, we will discuss making a checklist. I use these checklists to assist in re-establishing my fundamentals each time I pick up an instrument. In addition to checklists, I like to think of having a troubleshooting guide I can refer to if something in my playing is not working the way I want. Arguably the most important universal concept we can talk about is breathing. Whether we are playing a piccolo or a contra clarinet, the way we take air into our body remains the same. How we manage the air leaving from our body will have nuanced differences based on the instrument, but we must first learn to inhale. You have probably heard, you need to breathe from your diaphragm. You aren't supporting enough. I know I did, and I repeated these statements many times. It wasn't until I watched some videos with master musician and educator Keith Underwood that I really started to breathe properly. You can find links to these videos in the accompanying materials. I really encourage you to check them out on your own. I will provide my own abridged description of the breath and how I visualize it, but these videos contain a wealth of information that every woodwind player should explore. One of the things that Mr. Underwood talks about in these videos that really resonates with me is that we should breathe in low to high and exhale high to low. This relates back to the old adage of breathe from your diaphragm or support more. Yes, there needs to be some abdominal engagement to take a full breath, but that is only part of the story of taking a full breath. A full breath starts with the abdominal region expanding to make room for the lungs to fully expand. But if we stop there, the lungs have not had a chance to fill up with air. The full breath then involves expansion of the lungs, including movement of the rib cage. If you truly take a full breath, you can feel the expansion in your upper back as the rib cage expands to create more room for the fully inflated lungs. I like to visualize a balloon inflating. Sure, we can blow air into the balloon, and it starts by the bottom expanding. But if we stop here, that's a pretty sad balloon, and it hasn't reached its maximum potential. This is a balloon that's inflated closer to its full potential. The bottom expanded first, but we still continued to fill it with air, and the top expanded. Take the same fully inflated balloon, and we force the air out from the bottom first. It's not a very efficient way of using our air. We can't really control the speed at which the air is leaving the balloon, and we run out very quickly. If instead we allow it to leave the balloon naturally from the top first, and then gradually increase pressure from the bottom to refill the top of the balloon, the air lasts much longer. One of the other crucial concepts for all woodwind instruments is understanding how air impacts the pitch that comes out of the instrument. In general, higher pitches require faster air, and lower pitches require slower air. This seems pretty simple, but we tend to equate faster speed with greater volume or quantity, and slower speeds with less quantity. We have to learn to change speed without changing quantity. How do we do that? We do that by manipulating apertures. With every woodwind instrument, we are shaping the air as it leaves our body to maximize the efficiency of the way it enters the instrument we are playing using apertures. That can be internal or external, or a combination of both. We have two apertures, or openings, that we are managing. One aperture is created by our body, and the second is created by the instrument. This is easiest to see on the flute. The flute has an embouchure hole. This is one aperture that is on the instrument itself, and the second aperture is created by the separation of our lips. We have the same setup on reed instruments. The aperture of the instrument is created by the space between the reed and the mouthpiece, and the aperture of our body is created internally by the shape of our oral cavity. We can adjust this aperture, or impact the airflow, by changing the position of our tongue. Anchoring the sides of your tongue on your front top molars creates a number of benefits. It creates compression for the airstream as it leaves the body and enters the instrument. It should leave the front or tip of the tongue free to articulate in a variety of positions for the various instruments, and it should still allow for the back portion of the tongue to be relaxed so that we don't constrict our airway. The last universal concept to discuss is forming an embouchure, or the way we apply our face to the instrument. One of the main points to consider for playing multiple instruments is when forming the embouchure, the size should relate to the aperture of the instrument we are playing. If I set up to play piccolo with my jaw and lips positioned similar to playing the baritone saxophone, I'm going to have an airstream with lots of volume and very slow air, not what the piccolo needs. To compensate, I will have to push even more air out, run out of air very fast, and probably sound pretty terrible. If my aperture is appropriate for the instrument, we will be on the road to creating a beautiful sound that we can control and also make the physical aspect of playing the instrument easier, so we can focus on music making. One of the best ways to find our embouchures is to take lessons with a great teacher, skilled in diagnosing and solving problems in this area. That isn't always a possibility for everyone, but that doesn't mean we can't make progress with self-study and research. One of the main things to consider when forming your embouchure is that we must maintain flexibility to access the different registers of the instrument and easily switch from one instrument to the next. I'm going to present some of the standard methods for finding your embouchure on each instrument, and also talk about adjustments that I have to make for my own anatomy. Let's take a look at the flute. We're going to talk about how to find our embouchure, how to control the airstream, and how to have a flexible embouchure that adjusts the airstream for different registers of the flute. We may spend a little more time on the flute, but that's because I find this to be the most difficult instrument to pick up for reed players if it doesn't click right away. In the simplest of terms, to achieve a great sound with control on the flute, we want to create a small, oblong hole between our top and bottom lips. The tongue should be forward and relaxed. Your lower lip should cover 1/4 to 1/3 of the hole on the head joint. The air needs to be split across the far wall of the embouchure hole of the flute. Finding the optimal spot for the head joint to rest will be different for everyone, but generally speaking, it should rest in this fleshy section of your face between your lower lip and your chin. Aim the air lower and into the flute for lower notes, and gradually raise the airstream to play higher notes. We need faster air for high notes and slower air for low notes. That was all a very textbook explanation of forming the flute embouchure, and it probably works well for most people. I'm not one of those people. Flute has been a very long struggle for me. It did not come naturally, and still to this day, I have to work very hard to maintain my flute chops. The biggest challenge for me has been finding my embouchure without the physical interaction of a mouthpiece or double reed. My experience has been that the shape of my lips does not make me a particularly natural flute player. I have a bit of a teardrop in the center of the formation of my lips. This is very common, but it can split the airstream, which is far from ideal for playing the flute. Having said this, it is not impossible to play the flute with less than ideal facial structures. Many of the world's greatest players have unique facial structures that they have learned to work around. Sometimes this may require setting the flute on the face, off-center, or angled down towards the floor, or any number of other variations contrary to what most textbooks may tell you. That is totally fine. There's a great video from Sir James Galway about forming the embouchure for the flute. I'll provide a link to the video and the accompanying materials so you can check it out yourself, but I'll give a brief explanation of his version of finding your embouchure. You're going to roll your lower lip over your upper lip like this. And you're going to take your finger and have it rest here. And rather than pulling the lip down, you're going to use your airstream to create an opening. I suggest you do this process in front of a mirror. Take note of how your embouchure forms as you allow the airstream to create the embouchure rather than using your muscles to force an embouchure to happen. Another important thing to note is that he recommends using the muscles we use to frown, not to smile. And I think that's great and was very eye-opening for me. When we frown, it helps elongate our lips and create a horizontal opening without adding extra tension. A lot of people will tend to smile. This draws the lips tight back against the teeth. And you may be able to play in one register fairly effectively, but you won't have much flexibility for accessing the different registers of the flute. Let's go through this process with the head joint and see if we can find our embouchure. Remember, lower lip over the top lip. Allow your frowning muscles to provide support, and let the air create the aperture. Now for me, I acknowledge that my most resonant sound on the head joint alone is closer to an A flat. I believe for most flute players, and in Sir Galway's video, he's closer to a concert A. I don't have a great explanation for that. I just know that in my own experience, when I find myself at a concert A on the head joint alone, if I play in that position, I don't really have control over the upper register of the flute. And I think it has to do with the offset of my upper and lower lip and the way my airstream is formed naturally. One other thing to note that I think may be missing from Sir Galway's video is learning how far in or out to be rolled with the head joint. So I recommend going through the process of lower lip over upper lip, let the airstream form the embouchure, but then play with rolling the head joint in and out to find your most resonant sound. During this process is a great time to experiment with the position of the head joint on your face. If your natural aperture that you create with your airstream is not the textbook centered position that you may see online or in any other resources, experiment with setting further left to right or angled one way or the other and find that most resonant sound. Once you've found that point that you feel comfortable with, now it's time to take a look at putting the head joint on the flute. One of the biggest things that I've overlooked in my own flute playing is just how to hold the instrument. I kind of took it for granted that I've been playing instruments for years and I know how to hold an instrument. I know where my fingers go. But the thing that I never took into consideration is the balance of the flute. We don't have a neck strap and we're holding it out to the side like this, which is not a very natural position. With modern flutes, with all of this keywork and metal on the top of the instrument, it's very top heavy and it wants to roll in or out if you don't have it perfectly balanced. So while most textbooks will tell you to line up the embouchure hole with the top of the keys, you may be able to see that that is not a balanced position for me with where I need to have the embouchure hole set for my playing. So since we've established where you need the embouchure hole set for your face, for your embouchure, now we need to establish where you need to hold the flute for it to be balanced. There are 2 points I like to check to see if I'm really holding it in a balanced position. Can I transition from C to D in the middle register without feeling like the flute is going to roll one way or the other? And can I just hold an open C sharp without feeling like the flute's going to fall out of my hands? Going through this process, you have to be really honest with yourself and really pay attention to any excess tension that you may be using in your hands to compensate for the flute wanting to roll one way or the other. Also watch for excess pressure of pushing the flute into your face. That's another way you may be compensating for an unstable position of the flute itself. There's a few different ways you can think about holding the flute. I'm going to provide a link to a video that I think does a much better job explaining some different procedures than I will do. You can find that in the accompanying materials. Now that we've found our embouchure and a comfortable position for holding the flute, we just need to put in the time to find consistency and control over our sound. There are micro adjustments that need to be made to play in the different registers of the flute efficiently. Higher notes or partials require faster air, not more air. Separating these two concepts can be challenging, but will change your wind playing. How do we create faster air without blowing more air? Aiming the air slightly higher against the back wall should be your first goal. If you're a visual learner, I am. This tool, called the Numo Pro from Blocky Flute, is a great visual aid in learning where your airstream is going. Again, I'll provide a link to this tool in the accompanying materials, but just you can see how it works. It's a head joint with a cutout, and then there's these series of fans that as you blow air, you can get a visual representation not only of where your air is aiming, but also how efficient your air is. Let's get into some exercises using the overtone series to help develop flexibility and diagnose any problems we may be having. A real quick overview of the overtone series. This is the acoustic pattern our instruments follow, and it plays a big role in how we perceive the sound of each instrument and individual. Think of your brass player colleagues playing lip slurs. Those are just overtone exercises. They aren't always introduced at an early age for woodwind players, but they are very important and can teach us a lot about how we should be using our air. All notes in these accompanying exercises should be played using the fingering of the lower note that you see in parentheses below. When you first start these, your lower notes will probably be quieter than the top notes. That's okay, that's natural. But we want to try and make each note the same volume. Find the adjustments you need to make physically, whether that be jaw, lip, or tongue movement, to change where your air is going to make each note speak. Always try to start the sound with your air and not your tongue. Let's remove another variable, articulation, while we discover how to control and aim our airstream. If you're coming from a larger instrument to the flute, say tenor saxophone or bass clarinet, you may find that you naturally make large adjustments. The smaller the instrument we are playing, the smaller our adjustments can be and still have a big impact. This is always an important point for me as I spend most of my time playing large woodwinds. I really have to make a point of remembering to keep my movements small when I am on the flute and other small woodwinds. Here's one last major consideration for flute playing when you have started on clarinet or saxophone. Pitch tendencies with regards to volume are backwards on the flute compared to clarinet and saxophone. The louder you play on the flute, the higher your pitch will get, and the opposite is true. The quieter you play, the flatter your pitch will be. If you've already developed good habits with regards to making pitch adjustments for dynamic adjustments on clarinet or saxophone, you'll have to do some retraining every time you pick up the flute. Let's take a look at flute exercise number 1. I'm going to play through just a little bit of this and maybe talk through my thought process as I'm going through these exercises. Now, one important consideration when you're practicing overtones on any instrument and just sound exercises in general, you're not necessarily going to sound good as you're doing this. That's okay. This is a chance for growth, and it's okay to sound bad as we dial in all of our variables and try to get a more accurate, flexible sound. This is coming from exercise number 1. So my thought process on those first 2 exercises, they're the first 2 measures of exercise number 1. I'm trying to make sure that I'm really set for that first note in the upper register. My embouchure naturally tends to play the lower register better, so I have to work more to make sure that I'm set for the upper register. For what I just played, I felt like the first F on top of the staff actually came out pretty well, and my slur down to the bottom F, they were pretty even as far as terms of dynamic. Now when I went to E in the next measure, that first E wasn't to my liking. It kind of cracked a little bit and popped out, so I repeated it. All of these exercises that you see, you'll see they're written in half notes, but they're really meant to be played out of time when you're first exploring overtones. You just need to find the control that you need and the movements that need to happen. So don't worry about playing these exercises in time. As you become more comfortable, we want to be able to play these in time so that we can make the changes on demand. But really, these are exploratory exercises to begin with. I'm going to turn sideways so that hopefully you can see some of the movement that I have to use to move from the upper partial down to the lower. For me, it's a combination of my lips being pushed out for the upper register and pulled in a little bit with a little bit of jaw movement for the lower register. If you're like me and your lower register is a bit more of your strong point, you may have better luck starting on exercise number 4 to begin with. Have that established full sound of your low register and see if you can comfortably transition into the upper register. As I'm approaching exercise number 4, my goal is to ascend to the upper register without really performing a crescendo. Like we said, our natural tendency is when we need faster air, we want to use more air. We want to separate those two. So this is a great time to practice that. As we start to look at exercises 2, 3, and 5, we're starting to get into the second partial of our fundamental notes. This may be a little challenging at first. I've written these to maintain continuity going from the fundamental of C through F. But when we start to get into the second partial, it may be appropriate to start in a lower fundamental note. For example, maybe starting with D as the fundamental. So if we're looking at exercise 2 and I'm first getting into these second partials, I might start in measure 4 of exercise 2. So now that we've established our sound on the flute and our embouchure and the way we're going to hold the instrument, I'm just going to go over my checklist. Like I said, these checklists are things that I use to help establish my playing on the instrument quickly when I pick it up, whether that be to practice during my normal practice routines or if I'm switching quickly in a performance situation. I need to be able to set myself quickly for the instrument I'm playing. This is my checklist on the flute. And these reflect what I'm working on currently, and they change. So this is some of the things that are important to me right now when I pick up the flute. Hold the flute in a balanced position. Is it wanting to roll in or out? Don't apply excess pressure to the lower lip by forcing the flute into your face. Use frowning muscles, not smiling. Tongue forward. Fast air through compression, not volume. Jaw closed more than you think. That's my current checklist. What's yours? Some final thoughts on the flute. It can be a very frustrating instrument if you're not a very natural flute player. That's okay. Some things to keep in mind. I know myself as a saxophone player and clarinet player, when I get frustrated, my natural tendency is try to force things to happen. I'm going to force this reed to vibrate the way I want to. I'm going to force the air to go the way I want. That's not great on any instrument, but especially the flute. The more I try to force the flute to do what I want, the more it just tells me no. So, if you can always remember just to be relaxed when you play the flute. Let the air do the work. And just the changes that we need to do physically, whether it be with your lips or your jaw forward and back, it's very subtle and they're minute and they shouldn't be forceful changes. The more you can take that into consideration, the more successful you'll be with your flute playing. It's time to talk about the clarinet. We need to make an embouchure, and we need it to do two things. We want to create an ideal geometry internally for producing an efficient airstream with plenty of compression. appropriate for the clarinet, and we want the embouchure to create a seal around the reed and mouthpiece. For this exploration, we're going to start with just the mouthpiece and barrel. Internally, we're going to use a very similar tongue position to the flute, tongue forward. Sides might be up, resting on our upper front molars more than you would for flute. Think of saying the word d, d. Back and forward portions of the tongue relaxed, and tip of the tongue free to make adjustments to our airstream. Now for the external portion of the embouchure, you may hear use a pointed chin or flat chin, smile or don't smile, roll your lower lip in more, roll your lower lip out, use a double lip. This can all be very confusing. I believe this is where individual anatomy comes into play and should guide our decisions. There is no one-size-fits-all method for this. We want to create a firm, but not tight, base for the reed to sit on. The amount of our lips, along with how taut they are, can impact the vibrations of the reed and the overall tone quality we produce. I like to visualize my jaw and lower lip creating a bed for the reed to lie on. The sides of my lip and chin that do not interact with the reed create a firm support, matching the rails of the reed. The portion of my lip that touches the vibrating portion of the reed needs to be just right. Firm enough to provide support for the vibrations of the reed, but not so firm as to induce biting and hinder the oscillations of the reed. For me, this involves drawing the lower lip in towards my teeth, and does not require a lot of rolling of the lower lip over my teeth. There are two main schools of thought for the upper lip. Some people play double lip, top lip rolled over the top teeth, and some people play with teeth on the mouthpiece. Double lip helps alleviate excess tension and excessive biting in the embouchure while promoting a lifting of the soft palate in your oral cavity, which has positive effects on your sound. The single lip embouchure provides more stability and security when playing the instrument. You can achieve the best of both styles of playing with the single lip embouchure, but consciously making an effort to roll the upper lip in and down while avoiding tension in the throat. I encourage you to experiment with both. I frequently warm up with most of my tone development exercises with the double lip and transition to single lip for the rest of my practice sessions. Now that we have the embouchure and aperture set, we need to bring the mouthpiece into the mix. I recommend experimenting with this next process on the mouthpiece and barrel alone. We need to find the correct angle and depth for taking the mouthpiece into our mouth. Do you remember back to our tongue position we talked about? Forward, sides on the molars, think of saying D. We want a position for the mouthpiece that gives us the closest proximity between the aperture created by our tongue and the soft palate and the aperture created by the reed mouthpiece combination. This will give us the greatest compression of the air with the least amount of physical strain. I try to find that angle that will allow the tip of the mouthpiece to almost contact the roof of my mouth, while at the same time making sure that my lower lip is not placed into a position that causes me to bite on the reed. This angle will vary for everyone depending on your degree of overbite or underbite. Don't be afraid to be different. I've seen great players who play almost vertically and those that play close to horizontal. My most resonant sound is approximately a concert F sharp. And I play best when I play close to vertical. If you find your most resonant sound is wildly different from concert F sharp, there could be any number of reasons. Reed too soft or too hard, barrel too short or too long, airstream too slow or too fast, lip pressure on reed too much or too little, incorrect mouthpiece position in your mouth. I'll demonstrate what happens to my sound as I just change the angle of the mouthpiece entering my mouth. The only thing that I was changing was the angle that the mouthpiece entered my mouth. And you could hear that at some points I couldn't even get a sound out with the exact same reed and internal shape that I'm used to using. The ultimate test is, can you play in tune with a good sound without experiencing abnormal physical fatigue? If you answer no to any of those questions, then it's time to explore all of the variables we just talked about to find a solution. Try changing one variable at a time to see if it changes anything. Ultimately, all of these elements work in synergy, and adjusting one variable may require fine-tuning another. Holding the clarinet properly can also be an overlooked element for multiple woodwind players. Covering the holes completely can be one of the biggest challenges for anyone that began on another instrument. Find a hand position that allows the pad of your finger to contact the tone holes. Too much of an arc, and you won't be able to effectively create a seal on the holes, leading to lots of unintended squeaks and squawks. In addition to position and arc of the fingers, try not to use excessive pressure when covering the tone holes. It really doesn't require a lot of pressure to create a seal on the tone holes, and conservation of energy and effort in that regard will serve you well. I find as a saxophone player who plays large saxophones a lot of the time, I get what I call clamp hands and really force down the keys, and especially on clarinet, it's just not necessary. If you have an adjustable thumb rest, as many instruments do these days, find the right position for you. I also recommend neck straps if you need that security. While the use of a neck strap is not always practical in performing situations that require quick switches of instruments, it will inform you on proper support of the instrument and finger position. Let's look at some sound exercises. I do believe overtone exercises to be a great tool for the clarinet, and I'll provide one for you. However, I find overtones on the clarinet to be very difficult at first. This is due to the odd makeup of the clarinet's overtones and the very large leap between the fundamental and first partial. This first exercise will help prepare us to explore overtones on the clarinet by training our oral cavity and ears for the leap of a 12th. Strive for a smooth transition between the lower note and the higher note. No bumps in volume as you ascend, and maintain a consistent quality of sound between registers. The clarinet can be deceiving for saxophone and flute players. The low register speaks very easily on the clarinet, but that does not mean we get to be lazy with the quality of our air. We still have to take a full breath and maintain compression in our airstream to achieve a focused sound. When you feel comfortable with this exercise, you can start to explore the overtone exercise. Learning to hear the intervals is the first challenge. Try not to achieve the upper note with excessive pressure against the reed. Experiment with tongue position to find the right amount of compression to get that upper partial to speak. If you're having trouble, start the upper partial with the register key, then release the register key and see if you can maintain the upper note. Again, our goal is to start each note with our air and remove the variable of articulation. When slurring to the lower notes, it may sound unpleasant at first with a lot of non-musical sounds between pitches. That's okay. This is how we find the adjustments to our airstream necessary to move between partials. Eventually, you will be more efficient with these adjustments, and those non-musical sounds will diminish. Again, just like our flute exercises that are written with meter and rhythm, these exercises, when you first start, are meant to be done out of time so that you can really explore the sound and think critically about how you're playing. I'll play a little bit of exercise 1 and 2 and then demonstrate the overtones in 3. So as I'm ascending the 12th, I'm really trying to be conscious of the pitch and also making sure that it sounds like the same instrument in both registers and not separate instruments. I'm taking the same approach to these first few measures of exercise 2. The real thing to focus on here is speeding up the air for the third note in the series without increasing the volume of air that you're putting into the clarinet. I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of number 3 so that you get an idea of maybe some of those non-musical sounds that'll happen when you're exploring the slur down in the overtone series. For the clarinet, as we descend on the fundamentals of the instrument towards our low E through low G fingering, that's when I find these partials to get exceedingly difficult and very hard to manage, and you start to get more non-musical sounds. I still do my best to have a nice air entrance in the pure tone with no other pitches sneaking in, but it's very difficult. We're going to wrap up our time with the clarinet by just talking through my own personal checklist that I go through when I pick up the clarinet. First thing is holding the clarinet in a comfortable position for the right thumb. I have a bad tendency to not think about my right hand position and get a lot of excess tension in my right hand and thumb, and it can get pretty painful after a while. Ensuring the correct angle of the mouthpiece for me, which is more vertical and tucked in a little bit more than my natural tendency. Upper lip engagement. This can really alleviate pressure on the reed and enhance resonance, and I notice a big difference in my playing when I remember. Lower lip provides firm support with a stable jaw, not biting. I do have a bad habit of biting on clarinet, and it's something I'm trying to break. Consider the width of the clarinet reed when focusing the embouchure. I have to remind myself that the clarinet mouthpiece and reed is much narrower than the reeds I'm usually dealing with when I play bari sax and bass clarinet, and I just need to focus my embouchure differently. Tongue forward, sides of tongue resting on front top molars. My tongue position on clarinet and the pivot point where it rests on my molars is much further forward than when I play large saxophones. Tip and back of tongue relaxed. I have a tendency to have very tense tongue when I play, and it impacts my articulation. Light pressure on tone holes. This is one I've been working on a lot lately, so it's down at the bottom of my list, but I'm really trying to work on lightening up my fingers. All right, it's time to talk about saxophone. Now, a lot of the same principles we talked about with the clarinet and flute will apply to the saxophone. The mechanics of tone production we speak about today will be universal to producing a good sound on the saxophone, no matter the style of music you're playing. We need to find our embouchure, find optimal tongue placement, angle and position of the mouthpiece, and make sure we're holding the instrument in an efficient manner. We're probably not going to spend as much time talking about the saxophone today due to a lot of these things. I'm going to point out some key differences between the clarinet embouchure and the saxophone embouchure, and talk about some pitfalls for those of you that may be coming from a flute or clarinet background, and then check out our checklist and sound exercises. So a lot of the elements of the clarinet embouchure will be very similar for saxophone. Big things to consider is the width of the saxophone mouthpiece that you may be playing. If you're playing tenor or baritone, the amount of your lip that doesn't need to be super tight is going to be much larger than on the clarinet. And you may not need to get into as much of a pointed smile or flat chin as you may need for clarinet. The tongue position can be a little different as well. Saxophone mouthpieces tend to have larger tip openings, and the facing length tends to be longer. So you need to have more of the mouthpiece in your mouth. If you try to play with your tongue in that same front position, you're either not going to have the mouthpiece in far enough so that it doesn't get in the way, or you're just going to have a really constricted sound and your tongue's going to be very tense. So when I play saxophone, especially tenor and bari, that anchor point from the side of my tongue tends to be further back towards my mid to back molars. And that, I find, allows me to take more of the mouthpiece in without creating a bunch of extra tension. This also impacts my articulation point. We haven't talked too much about how to use the tongue to articulate on the other instruments, as I think that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But I will say that I don't necessarily tip of the tongue to the tip of the reed when I'm playing larger saxophones. It's further back on my tongue, just because I have more of the mouthpiece in my mouth, and my tongue just doesn't move that way. Now, the angle is going to be quite a bit different from the clarinet as well. Finding the right angle for the mouthpiece is going to depend, again, on your underbite or overbite. But in general, it's going to be closer to a horizontal angle than it is vertical, like with the clarinet. That's not to say that it's not possible and optimal for you to have more of a vertical entry into your mouth with your mouthpiece, just that you need to treat it differently as it's a different instrument. We're going to experiment much in the same way that we did on clarinet with the mouthpiece and barrel to finding our resonant sound on saxophone. We're going to use the mouthpiece and neck. We also need to talk about lower lip position. In the classical world of saxophone, a lot of players play with their lower lip rolled in quite a bit over their lower teeth. And in jazz world, you may see lots of players with their lower lip rolled out so far that you might think their teeth are on the reed. I think that this is just a tool that we have to address the quality of sound that we want to produce. I find that the more I have my lower lip rolled in, the more it dampens the reed and the upper partials of the sound. And the opposite is true. The further I roll it out, the more I'm able to access the upper partials in the sound, making a little bit brighter and more strident of a sound. I use different positions for different settings and different sounds, and I think it's just like the palette that you may use for a painting. Being able to use different ones makes you a more versatile player. So my most resonant sound on mouthpiece and neck for tenor is about a concert E. Now this is a great time to experiment with all of our variables that we can address for this. More or less mouthpiece in the mouth, different position for your tongue. On this setup, now we can experiment with the actual position of the mouthpiece on the neck cork and how far in or out you may be. For alto and bari players, on alto, mouthpiece and neck alone, I'm about a concert A flat. And on baritone, it's around a concert D. Again, this is just a general guideline, and this can help you get in the ballpark to finding your sound. We're going to talk real briefly about neck straps and neck strap placement for the height of your instrument, just because it's really important that this doesn't diminish anything that we just discovered by playing the mouthpiece and the neck alone. I see a lot of players that have their neck strap set so low that if I lower this way down, I'm creating undue pressure from my lower lip on the reed and the mouthpiece just because of the angle that it's entering my mouth. It can be uncomfortable, but a higher position of the neck strap allows the mouthpiece to enter more like the angle that you find when you're playing just the mouthpiece and neck alone. Because of this, I prefer neck straps that stay in place well. The slider doesn't adjust when I don't want it to. And I like this part that supports you with your neck, or whether you might be wearing a harness. I like it to be firm and not bouncy at all, so that there's no inconsistencies with the horn when you pick it up. If you're coming from more of a flute or clarinet background to the saxophone, especially the larger saxophones, two main things to look out for as you're getting comfortable on the saxophone are your jaw position and the speed of your air. In general, I see lots of flute and clarinet players that are just too closed here, which makes for a lot of excess tension in your embouchure for the saxophone. We need to be looser in general and just more open. And the airstream can also be quite different. You don't necessarily need as fast of an airstream when you're playing the saxophone as you do with the flute or the clarinet, but it might take more air than you're used to using. So think open, slower, larger airstream. Again, we're going to use overtones to start exploring our sound and control on the saxophone. They're a fantastic tool, and they'll really teach you a lot about playing the saxophone and finding your own sound on the instrument. We're going to start much the same way we did on flute, where we're slurring from the first partial down to the fundamental. Again, start with your air, not your tongue, and try to separate dynamic, or the loudness of the notes you're playing, from what you're playing, and go for even dynamic between octaves and partials. As I'm going through these exercises, I'm thinking about the quality of sound, trying to match the pitch from octave to octave, and really trying to make sure that that low octave doesn't pop out because I'm using volume of air to make the low note speak rather than adjusting pressure and allowing a larger quantity of air to come out slower. The first time I noticed it just now was on the E flat. Let's talk through my checklist. So, setting the height of the neck strap so that the mouthpiece comes to you without you adjusting the tilt of your head. Ensuring the correct angle of the mouthpiece for me. Lower lip relaxed and adjust the in and out position if coming from clarinet. Consider the width of the saxophone reed when focusing embouchure. Tongue forward, sides of tongue resting on top molars. Further forward for small saxes, but back for the large saxes. Tip and back of tongue relaxed. Adjust neck so hands are in comfortable position. Make sure hands don't easily bump palm and side keys.